What do poems do? Well, don't look at me. Let's see what Robert Frost had to say. Welcome back, my friends, to Writing with Andrew and National Poetry Month. You gotta love a good April. Erratic temperatures, probably final exams or something. All those showers that bring May flowers and the first little tingles of allergy season. It's good times. Yeah, well, I was gonna say that was the silver lining, so... Okay, well, you may have never guessed this, but I kinda like poetry, so I think a whole month dedicated to it is pretty neat, and I also like talking about poetry, so I'm taking the month of April as full authorization to talk about nothing but poetry for a few weeks. And today I thought we'd start the month with an essay about poetry that I keep coming back to, Robert Frost's The Figure a Poem Makes. It's an interesting little essay that perhaps unsurprisingly reads a lot like a poem. It's full of figurative language and associative leaps, and it rewards multiple readings. The first time I read it, I grasped exactly none of it. But each time I've read it since, I've come away with some new insight. So, as we like to do on the show, we won't be going over every little bit of it, but I will talk about some of my favorite nipperkins of Frostonian wisdom. And, of course, I'll recommend that you spend some time with it yourself and see what sticks to you. If my chronically absent mind decides to show up, I may even put a link to the essay in the description. Now that would be nice, wouldn't it? Okay, so then, without further ado and all of that business, Frost starts out with some thoughts on the ways poems sound. You know, because poems do audible things like have rhythm and rhyme. In fact, those are among my top 3 things that poems do. I've said it before and I'll say it again. If all a poem does is sound good, I'm a happy camper. Well, no, not literally. Can anyone be happy while camping? Obviously, the answer to that question is no, but I can be happy while listening to a poem that sounds good. In an alternate reality, I might have become a phonetician. But Frost lays a chill right down onto my sound enthusiasm with this sobering reminder. Granted, no one but a humanist much cares how sound a poem is if it is only a sound. The sound is the gold in the ore. It's kind of like that one time I was sitting in a classroom full of PhD students in a class about how to teach. The professor looked at us and reminded us that none of us were normal students, so we couldn't use our own experiences in school as a reliable way to understand our students. We were, after all, the weirdos who were getting PhDs. And now I'm one of the weirdos who ranks alliteration among the S-tier pleasures of life. In other words, I'm a humanist. So, for as much as I love following my ear through a poem, it's important to remember that sound by itself is not the end-all be-all for real people that it is for my own little virtual self. Instead, it's the gold in the ore. It might be the best part of the poem, but it does not by itself constitute a poem. How you say something matters immensely, but it's no substitute for what you say. You gotta have something to say first, and then the sound of it all gives it a shine and a glimmer that's so hard to beat. What's that? Okay, anywho, I remember thinking when I was a less experienced writer that I didn't have anything to say, but that I could say nothing really well. This is what I'm talking about. You can have technical skill and linguistic artistry, but only humanities professors are going to be impressed if you can't back it up with having something interesting to say. When I was a younger writer, saying nothing in pretty ways, I was also writing the most well-behaved little poems and essays. And by well-behaved, I mean that they didn't cut in line, didn't speak up for themselves, didn't ever try to see what would happen if you mixed red and green paint. We're painting poppies for crying out loud, keep those reds and greens separate. I think it was the product of a few stifling reagents, but it was mostly timidity. Something like a desire to make a good poem by making a well-mannered poem. Something also like the fear of doing something unusual and looking foolish. A while ago, I weaved some of this show into an assignment, and the next day in class, one of my students said that video was the most cringe thing they'd ever seen. Later, they explained that they meant it as a good thing, I guess, but I've been thinking about that a lot since. See, college me would have never sat alone in a room by himself and talked at a camera, and then, worst of all, put it up on the internet for people to see. College me cared a great deal about not looking foolish, But now I've got about years of experience on college me, and I know now that everything is foolish and there's really nothing to be afraid of. It's not that I'm unwittingly cringe, I just don't care in the same way anymore. But we're not talking about me, we're talking about poetry. And it's that same detached acceptance of cringe that may also drive a willingness to experiment more wildly with poetry.
Oh, a poem is supposed to be in 10-syllable lines with nature imagery and classical allusions.
No, let's write a poem about how raw onions make me think about Superman, or one about how anglerfish probably won't care when the apocalypse happens. Robert Frost says if it is a wild tune, it is a poem. Just as the first mystery was how a poem could have a tune in such a straightness as meter, so the second mystery is how a poem can have wildness and, at the same time, a subject that shall be fulfilled. Poems work by giving us fresh experiences. I can still hear the comments former teachers wrote on my poems about my images or phrases being familiar. Why say what's already been said? If you don't have anything to add, what are you doing? Poems offer novelty, freshness, defamiliarization. Frost talks about the surprise of knowing something he didn't know he knew. Show us the things we think we know in new ways. A poem should change the reader's relationship with the world in some way, and it's not going to do that if it's doing the same old well-behaved nonsense as everyone else. Do something weird, do something wild. The stakes really couldn't be lower, and you can't break poetry. And don't worry about looking foolish, because poetry is a silly thing. I don't think you can do it wrong, but taking it or yourself too seriously might just be the one way to mess it up. So play your wild tune and make that poem sing like a killdeer stuck in the rafters of Carnegie Hall. Richard Lanham has said, American pragmatism insists that words are for use, not enjoyment. American Puritanism insists that expression is a duty, not a pleasure. We learn to speed read our own language for the same reason. Such an attitude becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Prose written without joy can only be read in the same spirit. Poems are a pleasure, but so many are trained to think that poems are puzzles lined with razor wire and bounded by electric fences. Don't enjoy the poem. Tell us what it means. Who cares if the plums sound nice? Write me an essay on post-industrial refrigeration and its effects on 20th century domestic life. It was due yesterday, by the way. Just let people like stuff. When I said a few years ago that poems aren't riddles, I had no idea what kind of a controversy that would end up stirring among a tiny minority of self-important commenters. It was like I was threatening their I'm so smart self-image with the scandalous idea that a poem could be enjoyed, like just enjoyed and not analyzed. And yeah, of course poems offer something more than just pleasure, but that pleasure is an essential part of it. And I think a lot more people would get into the deeper stuff if they were just allowed to like poems first. But again, it's not just me saying junk like this. Bobby F. also chimed in a couple years before I did with this gem. The figure a poem makes. It begins in delight and ends in wisdom. The figure is the same as for love. It begins in delight, ladies and gentlefolks. It doesn't begin in master's theses, now does it? That's a poet laureate saying that poems begin with delight. And I think it's fair to say that they begin with delight on multiple levels. Inspiration arises from a delightful observation. The poem welcomes a reader in with something delightful. Someone follows the dark path into a lifetime of reading and writing poetry by finding delight in a few Hopkins poems in a Norton anthology. It can, and maybe must, begin in delight. I mean, what are we doing if we're not having some kind of fun? But, of course, it also ends in wisdom. That delightful observation about a dried-up seed on the sidewalk leads to some insight into the nature of aging. That urn tells us something about truth. Brinded cows acquaint us with their creator. It's almost like you could say that poems do offer prettiness and pleasure, but they need to be more than just a pretty description too. And that would be a pretty smart way to put it, don't you think? Poetry communicates experiences and facilitates human connection. It's not about packing up a secret message in inscrutable trick language. It's about shared humanity. And that requires sincere writers as much as it requires willing readers. As Robbie Bob puts it, no tears in the writer, no tears in the reader. No surprise for the writer, no surprise for the reader. Late last year, I was editing a video and it was boring me to nearly literal tears. Of course, those aren't the kinds of tears that Frost wants readers and writers to share, so I decided something had to change. Maybe that the tune had to get a little wilder. For what exactly? Of course, there are so many other gems in this essay, and I really do want to leave them for you to discover and rediscover. But I do also want to end on one more. This is the one that has found a spot sticky tacked to my office door. Scholars and artists thrown together are often annoyed at the puzzle of where they differ. Both work from knowledge, but I suspect they differ most importantly in the way their knowledge is come by. Scholars get theirs with conscientious thoroughness along projected lines of logic. Poets theirs cavalierly and as it happens in and out of books. They stick to nothing deliberately, but let what will stick to them like burrs where they walk in the fields. Somehow, we've largely succumbed to this strange idea that being a literary critic is more meaningful, prestigious, or worthwhile than being a creator of literary texts. And then, when writers stop writing for people and start writing for critics, well, that's when they become truly great. It's true, though, that the epistemological differences between scholars and poets can cause heartburn, the kind of heartburn that manifests as critical condescension and writerly resentment. Yes, that's a lovely little thing that you write those poems, but it would really be impressive if you could write a gassy 30-page thesis on Keats's oeuvre. Then maybe we'd be peers and we could have something to talk about. Scholars and poets are both in the business of inquiry. Scholars use formalized methodologies, and poets live in the world and write about whatever sticks. The rigors of poetry are not as systematic as the rigors of scholarship, but it's arch silliness to say that one is more or less legitimate than the other. Academia is an okay place, but it would be such an okayer place if people would just quit trying to prove who was smarter. Because really, it's a silly game. It's the rhetoricians who are smartest. Everyone else is just competing for second place, if we're being honest. So friends, that's Robbie Freese's take on poetry, as filtered through me. If you don't like that filter, I wonder what you're still doing here, but also I'm not complaining. Thanks for watching to the end. It's really the most valuable thing you could do for me. But really, thanks for being here with me once again. I hope you're as excited as I am for a whole month of poetry stuff. I mean, I know that you are. Who wouldn't be? Ooh, but I also just remembered one last bit. You know how writers often start writing and then they only really figure out what they're trying to say at the very end, but then they're at the end, so they quit? Or maybe that thing when writers think they have such a cool and dramatic way to end something, so they write a lot of boring and foolish stuff just to build an anticlimactic reveal at the end? Well, Robert F. Rost once said in a little piece called The Figure a Poem Makes, "It is but a trick poem and no poem at all, if the best of it was thought of first and saved for the last." Sure does make you think, doesn't it?